At my only daughter's wedding, her groom stopped me at the door. "We don't want you here. Only the important people for her." I had arranged a $6 million transfer for them, so I decided to crash the wedding with some news. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and comment the city you're watching from. I straightened my tie one last time in the rearview mirror, checking that the transfer confirmation was still safely tucked in my jacket pocket. $6 million. The number still felt surreal, even after 3 sleepless nights of paperwork and phone calls with my financial advisor. It was everything I had saved for Oakley's future, her wedding gift, her security, her freedom to chase whatever dreams she wanted without ever worrying about money. The venue was stunning, rolling hills dotted with ancient oak trees, a restored 19th century mansion gleaming white against the afternoon sun. Graham had insisted on having the ceremony here, despite the astronomical cost. At the time, I'd been proud that my little girl was marrying someone who wanted to give her the fairy tale wedding she deserved. Now, walking up the gravel path with my gift that could change their entire lives, I felt nothing but pure joy. Other guests streamed past me, women in flowing dresses and men in crisp suits. I recognized some faces, Oakley's college friends, a few distant relatives, but most were strangers. Graham's people, I assumed. He came from old money, the kind of family that had connections stretching back generations. I'd always felt a little out of place in their world, but today was different. Today, I had something that would prove I belonged here, that I could provide for my daughter just as well as anyone. The closer I got to the entrance, the more my excitement built. I imagined Oakley's face when I told her about the transfer. The way her eyes would light up, the way she'd throw her arms around me like she used to when she was little. We'd been distant lately. My fault, probably. I'd been so focused on building my business, on making sure she never wanted for anything, that I'd missed too many dinners, too many phone calls. But this would make up for all of that. I was maybe 20 feet from the entrance when Graham appeared, emerging from behind a column like he'd been waiting for me. He looked impeccable in his tailored tuxedo, not a hair out of place, but there was something in his expression that made my steps slow. It wasn't the warm smile of a soon-to-be son-in-law. It was cold, calculated. "Damon," he said, my name coming out flat and emotionless. "Graham!" I extended my hand, forcing enthusiasm into my voice. "Big day, huh? I can't wait to—" "You need to leave." The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually took a step back, certain I'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" "You're not welcome here." His voice was calm, matter-of-fact, like he was discussing the weather. "Oakley doesn't want you at her wedding." My mouth went dry. That's impossible. She's my daughter. Of course she wants me here." Graham's lips curved into something that might have been a smile if it had reached his eyes. "She specifically asked me to handle this. She didn't want to hurt your feelings by telling you herself." I felt the world tilt beneath my feet. "Where is she? I need to talk to her." "She's getting ready, and she's made it very clear that she doesn't want to see you today." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Look, Damon, I know this is hard to hear, but Oakley has been talking about this for months. She feels like you've never really been there for her. All those missed birthdays, all those times you chose work over family. She's ready to start fresh with people who actually matter to her. People who actually matter." The words echoed in my head, each repetition feeling like another knife twist. I thought about the transfer confirmation in my pocket, about all those late nights at the office, about every sacrifice I'd made to build something meaningful for her future. "I have something for her," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "A wedding gift. It's important." "You can mail it," Graham said dismissively. Then, louder, so that other guests walking by could hear, "I really think it's best if you respect Oakley's wishes and leave peacefully." I felt eyes turning toward us, curious stares from people I didn't know. Heat crept up my neck as I realized what was happening. I was being publicly humiliated at my own daughter's wedding, treated like some unwanted intruder. "Graham, please, just let me talk to her for 5 minutes. That's all I need." "She doesn't want to talk to you." His voice had an edge now, a warning. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." That's when I saw her. Through the glass doors of the reception hall, I caught a glimpse of white silk and auburn hair. Oakley was standing near the altar, surrounded by bridesmaids, but for just a moment, she turned toward the entrance. Our eyes met through the glass. She looked at me for what felt like an eternity, her expression unreadable. I raised my hand slightly, a tentative wave, hoping for some sign of recognition, some indication that this was all a misunderstanding. She turned away. Not a nod, not a smile, not even a frown. She simply turned her back on me and continued talking to her bridesmaids as if I didn't exist. The air left my lungs in a rush. This wasn't Graham's doing alone. This was Oakley's choice. My daughter, the little girl I'd read bedtime stories to, the teenager I'd taught to drive, the young woman I'd watched graduate college with tears of pride in my eyes. She wanted nothing to do with me. "I think we're done here," Graham said, his voice softer now, almost gentle. It was worse than his earlier coldness. The pity in his tone made my skin crawl. I nodded mechanically, unable to trust my voice. The transfer confirmation felt like it was burning a hole in my pocket, a reminder of how spectacularly wrong I'd been about everything. I'd thought money could fix our relationship, could prove my love in a way that words and presence apparently hadn't. I turned and walked back down the gravel path, each step heavier than the last. Behind me, I could hear the murmur of conversations, the clink of glasses, the sound of celebration that I was no longer part of. My phone buzzed with a text message, but I couldn't bear to look at it. Probably the bank confirming the transfer had gone through. $6 million, sitting in an account for a daughter who didn't want me at her wedding. By the time I reached my car, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I sat there for a long time, staring at the mansion where my daughter was getting married without me, trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong. But as I finally drove away, something nagged at me, something about the way Oakley had looked at me through that glass. There had been something in her eyes, not hatred, not disgust, but something else, something that didn't quite match the story Graham had told me. It would take me weeks to figure out what that something was, and when I did, it would change everything. 3 days passed before I could bring myself to leave the house. 3 days of staring at the transfer confirmation, of replaying Graham's words, of trying to understand how I'd become such a failure as a father that my own daughter would ban me from her wedding. I'd called in sick to work, something I hadn't done in over a decade. My assistant, Marie, had been concerned enough to stop by on Wednesday evening with soup and worried questions that I couldn't answer. How do you explain that your entire relationship with your child has been built on a lie you never knew you were telling? On Thursday morning, I finally forced myself to shower and get dressed. The house felt too quiet, too empty, filled with reminders of Oakley at every turn. Her high school graduation photo on the mantel, the ugly ceramic mug she'd made me in art class that I'd never had the heart to throw away, the bookshelf lined with photo albums documenting 25 years of her life. I pulled down one of the albums at random and found myself looking at pictures from her 8th birthday party. She was grinning at the camera, chocolate cake smeared across her face, surrounded by friends in our backyard. I remembered that day clearly, how I'd left work early to help set up, how we'd played hide-and-seek until dark, how she'd fallen asleep in my arms while I carried her to bed. When had that little girl become a woman who didn't want me in her life? I kept flipping through pages, searching for clues I might have missed. There she was at 10, winning her first science fair. At 12, braces gleaming as she held up a soccer trophy. At 15, trying to look sophisticated at her first formal dance. The progression was subtle at first, but once I started looking for it, I couldn't unsee it. In the earlier photos, Oakley always seemed to be looking directly at the camera, directly at me. Her smiles were genuine, unguarded, but somewhere around age 16, something changed. The smiles became more practiced, more distant. Her eyes started looking past the camera, as if she was already somewhere else. That's when I met Graham. I remembered the first time Oakley brought him home. She was 19, a sophomore in college, practically glowing as she introduced us. Graham had been charming, polite, everything a father could want in his daughter's boyfriend. He asked thoughtful questions about my business, complimented the house, helped clear the dinner dishes without being asked. "He's perfect, isn't he?" Oakley had whispered to me later that evening, her eyes shining with the kind of happiness I hadn't seen in years. And he had seemed perfect, maybe too perfect. I closed the photo album and walked to my study, where I kept more recent memories, birthday cards, graduation announcements, the occasional letter. As I sorted through them, a pattern began to emerge that made my stomach twist with unease. The last birthday card Oakley had sent me, just 2 months ago, was generic. Store-bought sentiment, with her signature at the bottom, no personal message. But the card from the year before had been different, longer, more personal, filled with inside jokes and memories of trips we'd taken together. What had changed between those two cards? I pulled out my laptop and started going through old emails, phone records, anything that might help me piece together when things had started to fall apart. The timeline that emerged was disturbing. 2 years ago, Oakley and I had talked on the phone every Sunday. Long conversations about her job, her friends, her plans for the future. She'd always been interested in hearing about my work, asking detailed questions about the projects I was developing. 18 months ago, those calls had become shorter, more businesslike. She'd stopped asking about my work and started declining invitations to family gatherings. 1 year ago, she'd moved in with Graham. 6 months ago, our conversations had dwindled to brief exchanges about logistics, when she might visit, what time to meet for dinner when she was in town. 3 months ago, she'd announced her engagement over text message. I stared at the data I'd assembled, feeling sick. It wasn't gradual estrangement caused by natural growing apart. It was systematic isolation, each connection between us severed with surgical precision. My phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. For a wild moment, I hoped it might be Oakley, calling to explain, to apologize, to tell me the whole thing had been a misunderstanding. Instead, it was my brother Tom. "Hey, how was the wedding?" he asked, and I could hear the forced cheer in his voice. "Sorry I couldn't make it out there, but Susan was still feeling sick from her chemo treatment." I had forgotten I'd told Tom about the wedding. "It was fine," I lied. "Did Oakley love her gift? You never did tell me what you ended up getting her." The transfer confirmation was still sitting on my desk, a monument to my miscalculation. "She was grateful," I said, the words tasting like ash. "I bet she was. You always were too generous with that girl." Tom paused. "You sound tired. Everything okay?" I almost told him the truth then, almost admitted that I'd been kicked out of my daughter's wedding, that I'd lost her without even realizing it was happening. But the words wouldn't come. "Just exhausted from all the planning," I said instead. After Tom hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness of my study, pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to solve spreading out before me. The phone calls that had stopped, the visits that had become increasingly rare, the way Oakley had started parroting opinions that sounded nothing like her own voice. And Graham, always Graham, hovering at the edges of every interaction, steering conversations, making suggestions, slowly building walls between my daughter and everyone who had loved her before he came along. I thought about the look in Oakley's eyes when she'd seen me through the glass at the wedding. Not hatred. I'd been wrong about that. It had been something else, something that made more sense now that I was starting to see the bigger picture. It had been fear. But fear of what? Of me? That seemed impossible. I'd never raised a hand to Oakley, never even raised my voice, except for the normal frustrations of parenting a teenager. We'd had our disagreements, sure, but nothing that would warrant that kind of reaction, unless she'd been told something, unless someone had convinced her that I was dangerous, unreliable, unworthy of her love. I picked up my phone and scrolled to Oakley's number, my thumb hovering over the call button. Every instinct told me to reach out, to fight for my daughter, to demand an explanation. But Graham's voice echoed in my memory. "She doesn't want to talk to you." What if he was right? What if I'd been so wrapped up in building a life for Oakley that I'd forgotten to actually live it with her? What if her rejection was justified, and I was just too blind to see my own failures? I set the phone down without making the call, but as I finally turned off the lights and headed to bed, one thought kept circling through my mind. The daughter who had banned me from her wedding was not the same person who had written me heartfelt birthday cards just 2 years ago. Something had changed her, molded her into someone I didn't recognize. And I was beginning to suspect I knew who was responsible. Tomorrow, I decided, I would start looking for proof. I started my investigation the way any father would, by calling Oakley's college friends. Sarah Martinez had been her roommate for 3 years, and they'd stayed close even after graduation. If anyone would know what had been happening in my daughter's life, it would be Sarah. "Mr. Fletcher?" Sarah's voice was cautious when she answered. "Is everything okay? Is Oakley all right?" The concern in her tone caught me off guard. "She's fine as far as I know. I was actually hoping you could tell me how she's been doing lately." There was a long pause. "You mean you don't know?" "Know what?" Another pause, longer this time. "Mr. Fletcher, when's the last time you talked to Oakley? I mean, really talked to her?" I thought about our increasingly brief phone conversations, the polite but distant exchanges that had replaced our once easy relationship. "It's been a while," I admitted. "She's been different since she moved in with Graham. Distant. She stopped returning my calls about 6 months ago, and when I ran into her at the grocery store last month, she barely acknowledged me. It was like talking to a stranger." Sarah's words confirmed what I'd been afraid to admit to myself. "Have you met Graham?" "Once at a party about a year ago. He seemed nice enough, but..." She trailed off. "But what?" "He never left her side. Not once. Every time someone tried to talk to Oakley alone, he'd appear with a drink or a comment that would redirect the conversation. And Oakley? She kept looking at him before she answered any questions, like she was checking for approval." My hands clenched around the phone. "Did she seem happy?" "That's the thing. I couldn't tell. She said all the right words, smiled at all the right times, but her eyes looked empty, like she was performing instead of actually being there." After hanging up with Sarah, I called 3 more of Oakley's friends. The stories were variations on the same theme: gradual withdrawal, canceled plans, a personality that seemed to be slowly disappearing. But it was Jessica, Oakley's study partner from law school, who gave me the information that changed everything. "I tried to stay in touch," Jessica said, her voice heavy with regret. "But after Oakley started dating Graham, she became so secretive. The last time I saw her, maybe 8 months ago, she had a bruise on her wrist. When I asked about it, she got this panicked look and made up some story about bumping into a door." My blood turned to ice. "A bruise?" "It was shaped like fingers, Mr. Fletcher, like someone had grabbed her too hard. But when I suggested she might want to talk to someone about it, she got angry and told me I was imagining things. That was the last time she returned any of my calls." "Gosh!" I hung up the phone with shaking hands. A bruise shaped like fingers. Oakley's increasingly isolated behavior. Her fear-filled eyes at the wedding. The pieces were forming a picture I didn't want to see. I spent the rest of that day researching Graham Whitmore online, something I probably should have done years ago when Oakley first started dating him. What I found was a carefully curated digital presence, LinkedIn profile showcasing his work at his family's investment firm, tasteful Instagram photos of expensive restaurants and weekend getaways, Facebook posts that painted him as a devoted boyfriend and, more recently, husband. But buried deeper in search results, I found something that made my blood run cold. A brief mention in a local newspaper from 3 years ago, archived in a crime database I had to pay to access. Graham Whitmore had been questioned in connection with the death of his previous girlfriend, a woman named Claire Morrison. The article was frustratingly vague. Claire had died in what was ruled an accidental fall down the stairs of her apartment building. Graham had been the last person to see her alive, but no charges were filed due to insufficient evidence. I read the article 3 times, my heart pounding harder with each pass. Then I started digging deeper. Claire Morrison had been 24 when she died, just 2 years older than Oakley was now. She'd been a graduate student in psychology, described by friends as bright, ambitious, and devoted to her boyfriend. According to the article, she'd been planning to break up with Graham the week she died. The similarities to Oakley's situation were terrifying. Young, intelligent woman, controlling boyfriend from a wealthy family, gradual isolation from friends and support systems. But it was the photograph accompanying the article that truly shook me. Claire Morrison had auburn hair and green eyes, just like Oakley. The resemblance was so striking they could have been sisters. Graham had a type. I called the newspaper that had originally run the story, hoping to speak with the journalist who'd written it. After being transferred 3 times, I finally reached David Chen, who was now working at a different paper. The Morrison case? David's voice sharpened with interest. That's a name I haven't heard in a while. Why are you asking? I explained my situation carefully, without mentioning Oakley by name. David listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. I always suspected there was more to that story, he said finally. Claire's friends painted a picture of an increasingly controlling relationship. They said Graham had convinced her to cut ties with her family, had her believing they were toxic and manipulative. By the time she died, he was essentially her only source of contact with the outside world. The words hit me like a physical blow. What made her want to break up with him? According to her roommate, Claire had started to see through his manipulation. She'd begun reaching out to old friends, talking about wanting to reconnect with her parents. The roommate said Claire was planning to move out the day after she died. And the police never pursued it? David sighed. Graham's family has connections, good lawyers, political influence. The physical evidence was ambiguous. She could have fallen, could have been pushed. Without witnesses or a clear motive, the case went nowhere. What about the roommate? Did she ever speak publicly about her suspicions? She tried to, but she was young, scared, and going up against one of the most powerful families in the state. Eventually, she moved away and stopped talking about it. Last I heard, she was living somewhere on the West Coast under a different name. After hanging up with David, I sat in my study staring at Claire Morrison's photograph on my computer screen. 24 years old, her whole life ahead of her. Dead because she'd tried to escape a toxic relationship. The thought that Oakley might be in the same danger made me physically sick. But how could I warn her? She'd made it clear she didn't want to talk to me, and even if she did, would she believe me? Graham had already spent months convincing her that I was the toxic one in her life. I thought about calling the police, but what would I tell them? That my son-in-law might be dangerous based on a 3-year-old case that was never prosecuted? They'd think I was a bitter father-in-law trying to cause trouble. No, I needed more evidence, more proof that Graham was a threat. I spent the next week digging deeper into Graham's past, using every resource I could find. Public records, social media archives, old newspaper clippings. What emerged was a pattern that made my skin crawl. Before Claire Morrison, there had been another girlfriend in college, a woman named Rebecca Torres, who had died in what was ruled a suicide. Before Rebecca, a high school girlfriend named Amy Chen, who had been hospitalized after a fall down her dormitory stairs. 3 women, 3 accidents, 3 deaths or near deaths of young women who had tried to leave Graham Whitmore. And now my daughter was married to him. The worst part was realizing how perfectly he'd executed his strategy with Oakley. He'd isolated her systematically, turning her against everyone who might have protected her. He'd convinced her that I was the problem, that her friends were jealous, that her family couldn't be trusted. By the time they'd gotten married, Oakley was completely dependent on him for her sense of reality. I looked at my phone, Oakley's contact information glowing on the screen. Every fiber of my being wanted to call her, to warn her, to somehow make her understand the danger she was in. But I knew it would backfire. Graham had spent too much time poisoning her against me. If I was going to save my daughter, I needed a different approach. I needed to be smarter than Graham, more strategic. I needed to find a way to expose him that Oakley couldn't dismiss or ignore. And I needed to do it fast, before she became the 4th woman in Graham's deadly pattern. The clock on my desk read 11:47 p.m. Somewhere across town, my daughter was sleeping next to a man who had killed before and would almost certainly kill again. The thought made it impossible to sleep. I opened my laptop and started making a plan. My first attempt to reach Oakley directly was a disaster. I'd waited 3 days after discovering Graham's deadly pattern, hoping to find the right words, the perfect approach that would penetrate the wall of manipulation he'd built around her. Finally, I couldn't wait any longer. I called her office at the law firm where she worked. Fletcher and Associates, this is Oakley. Her voice was crisp, professional. Oakley, it's Dad. Please don't hang up. There was a pause, then a sharp intake of breath. I told you I didn't want to talk to you. Sweetheart, I know what Graham told you about me, but you're in danger. Real danger. I've found things about his past that... The line went dead. I called back immediately, but this time the receptionist told me Oakley was unavailable and couldn't take calls. When I tried her cell phone, it went straight to voicemail. I'd been blocked. That evening, I drove to their house, a sprawling colonial in an exclusive neighborhood that Graham's family money had purchased. I parked across the street and waited, hoping to catch Oakley alone when she came home from work. Instead, I watched Graham's black BMW pull into the driveway with both of them inside. Even from a distance, I could see Oakley's body language, hunched shoulders, downcast eyes. She looked like a woman who'd been crying. My phone rang. Graham's number. Stay away from us. His voice was calm, controlled. Oakley told me about your pathetic attempt to contact her today. She doesn't want to see you, and she doesn't want to hear your paranoid delusions about me. Graham, I know what you did to Claire Morrison, and Rebecca Torres, and Amy Chen. There was a long silence. When Graham spoke again, his voice had changed. Gone was the polite facade he'd maintained for years. What remained was cold, predatory. You have no idea what you're dealing with, old man. Oakley believes you're having some kind of mental breakdown, that you're making up stories because you can't accept that she's moved on without you. If you continue this harassment, I'll have you committed for psychiatric evaluation. She's my daughter. She's my wife. And if you come near her again, I'll destroy what's left of your pathetic life. The line went dead, leaving me sitting in my car, hands shaking with rage and terror. Through the window of their house, I could see figures moving around inside. My daughter was in there with a killer, and she thought I was the crazy one. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Claire Morrison's photograph, her auburn hair so similar to Oakley's. I thought about Rebecca Torres, Amy Chen, all the young women who'd trusted Graham Whitmore and paid with their lives. By morning, I'd made a decision. If I couldn't reach Oakley directly, I'd have to find another way. I started by hiring a private investigator named Marcus Webb, a former police detective who specialized in cases involving domestic violence and missing persons. Marcus was expensive, but he had connections and resources I didn't. I need evidence, I told him over coffee in a downtown diner. Something concrete that proves Graham Whitmore is dangerous. Marcus studied the files I'd compiled, newspaper clippings, police reports, timelines of Graham's relationships. This is compelling, but it's all circumstantial. 3 accidents don't necessarily prove murder, especially when they happened years apart and in different jurisdictions. What would it take to prove it? Access to the original crime scenes, witness interviews, forensic evidence, the kind of investigation that should have been done 3 years ago, but wasn't. Marcus leaned back in his booth. The problem is, even if we could prove Graham killed these women, it doesn't necessarily help your daughter. If she's as isolated as you say, she'll just see it as an attack on her husband. So, what do you suggest? We need to document what's happening now. Current abuse, current control tactics. Build a case that shows she's in immediate danger. Marcus set up surveillance on Graham and Oakley's house using high-powered cameras and listening devices that were technically legal as long as we stayed on public property. What we captured over the next 2 weeks made my blood run cold. Graham controlled every aspect of Oakley's life. She wasn't allowed to drive alone. He dropped her off at work and picked her up every day. She had no access to their joint bank accounts. Her phone was monitored, her emails read, her movements tracked. But it was the audio recordings that were truly horrifying. You talked to your father today. Graham's voice was quiet, menacing. He called the office. I hung up immediately, just like you said. Oakley's voice was small, frightened. But you answered in the first place. Why would you do that unless you wanted to talk to him? I didn't know it was him until I heard his voice. I swear, Graham, I would never... You're lying! The sound of something crashing, possibly a glass or plate. You've been thinking about him, haven't you? Missing your toxic family? No, of course not. You're the only family I need. Prove it. Call him back and tell him you never want to see him again. Tell him he's dead to you. Graham, please. Do it now, or I'll assume you're still loyal to them instead of me. The recording continued, capturing Oakley's tearful phone call to my voicemail, her voice breaking as she repeated Graham's words like a script. Listening to it, I wanted to drive to their house and tear him apart with my bare hands, but Marcus held me back. We need more, he said. This shows psychological abuse, but we need evidence of physical violence or direct threats to her life. That evidence came sooner than I'd hoped. 3 weeks after starting surveillance, Marcus called me at 2 a.m. You need to get down here now. Something's happening. I threw on clothes and drove to the surveillance location, a vacant lot with a clear view of Graham and Oakley's house. Marcus was crouched behind camera equipment, his face grim. They've been fighting for the past hour, he said, handing me headphones. It's escalating. Through the audio feed, I could hear shouting, the crash of furniture being overturned. Oakley was sobbing, pleading with Graham to stop. Then there was a thud, followed by a scream that made my heart stop. We have to call 911, I said, reaching for my phone. Wait. Marcus grabbed my arm. Listen. Graham's voice came through the speakers, cold and calculating. Clean yourself up. If anyone asks, you fell down the stairs. Do you understand me? Yes, Oakley whispered. Say it back to me. I fell down the stairs. Good girl. Now get some ice on that bruise before it swells. Marcus and I looked at each other. We have him, Marcus said quietly. That's assault, intimidation, and witness tampering. But more importantly, it proves your daughter is in immediate physical danger. What do we do now? Now we call the police. But not 911. That would tip him off that someone's watching. I have a contact in the domestic violence unit, Detective Sarah Kim. She'll handle this discreetly. I spent the next hour pacing while Marcus made calls and compiled evidence. When Detective Kim arrived, she was a small woman with sharp eyes and the demeanor of someone who'd seen too much. This is good work, she said, reviewing our audio recordings and photographs. But getting her to testify will be the challenge. Victims of this level of psychological manipulation often protect their abusers, even when their lives are at stake. So what's the plan? We arrest him tonight, while we have evidence of fresh assault. But the charges might not stick if she doesn't cooperate. You need to be prepared for the possibility that she'll refuse to help us. She's my daughter, I said. I have to try. Detective Kim nodded. Then let's go save her. As we prepared to move on the house, my phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number. Dad, I need help. Graham's gone out, but he'll be back soon. I'm scared. Can you come get me? I showed the message to Detective Kim. She frowned. That's either perfect timing or a trap. Either way, I'm going, I said. Then we're all going. If this is legitimate, your daughter just handed us the break we needed. If it's a setup, you'll need backup. I looked at the house where my daughter was waiting, possibly for rescue, possibly to lure me into Graham's trap. Either way, 25 years of love and protection had led to this moment. It was time to find out if I was enough to save her. The front door was unlocked when I reached it, which immediately set off alarm bells in my head. Oakley had always been careful about security, even as a child. Detective Kim and her backup officers positioned themselves around the house, while I approached the entrance, my heart hammering against my ribs. Oakley? I called softly as I stepped inside. Dad? Her voice came from the living room, weak and trembling. Is that really you? I found her curled up on the couch, a bag of frozen peas pressed against her left cheek. Even in the dim light, I could see the angry purple bruise spreading from her eye to her jaw. Her lip was split, and there were finger-shaped marks around her wrist that looked fresh. Oh, sweetheart. I knelt beside her, fighting the urge to pull her into my arms. What did he do to you? I tried to leave, she whispered, not meeting my eyes. I packed a bag and was going to call you, but he came home early. He saw the suitcase and just lost it. Where is he now? He went to his parents' house. He always goes there when he needs to cool down. She looked up at me then, and I saw something I hadn't seen in years. My little girl, scared and needing her father. Dad, I'm so sorry about the wedding, about everything. He made me believe things about you that weren't true. What kind of things? Oakley's voice was barely audible. He said you only cared about money, that you'd been stealing from your business partners and would probably go to prison. He said you'd try to manipulate me with lies about him, if I ever tried to leave. He had documents, bank statements that looked official. My stomach clenched with rage. All fake? I think so. Tonight, when he was hitting me, he said things about other women, about Claire. She looked at me with hollow eyes. I looked her up online after he passed out. She looks just like me, doesn't she? Yes, she does. He killed her, didn't he? And the others? I took her hands gently, careful not to touch her bruises. I think so. But we're going to stop him before he hurts you any worse. That's when we heard the car door slam outside. Oakley went rigid with terror. He's back. Oh God, he's back early. He must have seen your car. He gripped my arm with surprising strength. Dad, you have to go. If he finds you here, he'll kill us both. I'm not leaving without you. You don't understand. He has guns, lots of them. And when he gets angry like this, she was hyperventilating now, her whole body shaking. Please, just go. I'll find another way to get out. The front door opened, and Graham's voice echoed through the house, calm and deadly. Honey, I'm home. And I see we have a visitor. I heard Detective Kim's voice through my earpiece, which Oakley couldn't see. Team's in position. We're moving in now. Well, Graham appeared in the doorway of the living room, and the change in him was shocking. Gone was any pretense of the charming, successful businessman. His hair was disheveled, his eyes wild, and there was something in his right hand that made my blood freeze. A gun. Well, well, he said, his voice eerily calm despite his appearance. The concerned father finally shows up. A little late, don't you think? Let her go, Graham. This is between you and me. Graham laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. Oh, but that's where you're wrong. This was never between us. This has always been about Oakley learning her place. He stepped closer, and I could smell alcohol on his breath, mixed with something else. The metallic scent of violence, of a man who'd crossed lines he could never uncross. Do you know what your precious daughter was doing tonight? Graham continued, waving the gun casually. She was packing a bag, planning to run away like a petulant child instead of working through our marriage problems like an adult. I taught her better than that, Oakley whispered, her voice barely audible. You taught her nothing, Graham snapped, his calm facade cracking. You filled her head with fairy tale notions about love and respect. But love isn't about weakness, is it, Oakley? Love is about commitment, about staying loyal even when things get difficult. I noticed movement at the window behind Graham, shadows that meant Detective Kim's team was getting into position. I needed to keep him talking, keep his attention on me. Is that what you told Claire Morrison? I asked. About commitment and loyalty? Graham's expression went perfectly still. What did you say? Claire Morrison, Rebecca Torres, Amy Chen. Should I keep going? The gun in Graham's hand started to shake, and for the first time since he'd entered the room, I saw real fear in his eyes. You don't know what you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about. I know about the insurance policies you took out on them. I know about the mysterious accidents that always seem to happen right after they tried to leave you. I know you're a serial killer who preys on vulnerable young women. Dad, stop, Oakley whispered, but I couldn't stop now. I could see the cracks in Graham's composure widening. The only thing I don't understand, I continued, is why you chose women who looked so much alike. Did it make it easier for you to pretend they were all the same person? Graham's face twisted with rage. They were all weak. All of them. They promised to love me forever, and then they tried to leave the moment things got challenging. They deserved what happened to them. And what about Oakley? Does she deserve to die because she finally saw through your lies? Oakley isn't going anywhere, Graham said, turning the gun toward my daughter. She's going to stay right here with me, where she belongs. And you're going to disappear just like all the other obstacles in my life. That's when Detective Kim burst through the window. Police! Drop your weapon! Chaos erupted. Graham spun toward the window, the gun tracking toward Detective Kim. Oakley screamed. I lunged forward, not thinking about anything except getting between the gun and my daughter. The tackle caught Graham off guard. We went down hard, his gun skittering across the hardwood floor. He was stronger than I'd expected and younger, but I had 25 years of rage and desperation fueling my strength. You destroyed my family, I growled, pinning him to the ground while officers swarmed the room. You turned my daughter against me and tried to kill her. Graham smiled, even with my knee pressed into his back and handcuffs being snapped around his wrists. She'll never forgive you for this. Even now, part of her still loves me. That's what you'll never understand. I didn't have to force her to stay. She chose me over you. I looked back at Oakley, who was being checked by a paramedic. Her eyes met mine across the chaos of the arrest, and for a moment I feared Graham might be right. Maybe too much damage had been done. Maybe she would blame me for destroying her marriage, even if it had saved her life. But then she mouthed two words that made my heart soar. Thank you. As they led Graham away, he turned back one last time. This isn't over, he said, his voice carrying all the menace he could muster. My family has resources you can't imagine. Lawyers, connections. I'll be out in 6 months, and when I am, I'll finish what I started. Detective Kim stepped beside me as we watched him being loaded into the police car. Don't worry about his threats. We have enough evidence to put him away for the rest of his life. The physical abuse, the murder evidence we found in his house during the search, his confession just now, he's never going to hurt anyone again. I nodded, but I was barely listening. All my attention was focused on Oakley, who was sitting on the couch looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. Dad, she said quietly as the last of the officers filed out of the house, can I come home with you tonight? I don't think I can stay here anymore. I walked over and carefully sat beside her, mindful of her injuries. Sweetheart, you can come home with me for as long as you need, forever, if you want. She leaned against my shoulder, and for the first time in years, I held my daughter close. I'm sorry I didn't believe you. I'm sorry I let him turn me against you. You have nothing to apologize for, I said, stroking her hair. He's a master manipulator. He fooled everyone, including me, for a long time. How did you figure it out? I thought about the weeks of investigation, the surveillance, the desperate search for evidence that would save her life. I remembered who you used to be, and I knew that wasn't the real you pushing me away. Oakley was quiet for a long moment. Then, Dad, that money you were going to give us as a wedding gift, what about it? I want to use it to help other women who are trapped like I was. Is that okay? I squeezed her tighter, pride swelling in my chest. There was my daughter, the compassionate, strong woman I'd raised, finally free from Graham's influence. I think that's a perfect idea, I said. Outside, the police cars were pulling away, taking Graham Whitmore out of our lives forever. Inside, for the first time in years, my family was whole again. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my house, making coffee for two and watching the morning sun stream through windows that had been dark for too long. Oakley was still asleep upstairs in her old room, the same room I'd kept exactly as she'd left it when she moved out for college, hoping someday she'd come home again. She'd been living with me since the night we'd arrested Graham, healing from wounds that went far deeper than the physical bruises on her face. The first few weeks had been the hardest. She'd wake up screaming from nightmares, convinced Graham was coming back for her. She'd flinch when I moved too quickly or spoke too loudly. She'd apologize constantly for taking up space, for being a burden, for existing at all. Graham had done more than isolate her from her family. He'd systematically destroyed her sense of self-worth until she believed she deserved the abuse. But slowly, painfully, my daughter was coming back to herself. The criminal trial had been a media sensation. Graham's family had indeed hired the best lawyers money could buy, but even they couldn't overcome the mountain of evidence we'd assembled. DNA from the crime scenes of his previous victims, financial records showing the insurance policies he'd taken out on them, and most damning of all, recorded confessions from the night of his arrest. He'd been sentenced to life without parole, and his appeals had already been denied twice. He would never hurt another woman again. His family had tried to contact Oakley multiple times, offering money in exchange for her silence about their son's crimes. She'd refused every attempt, choosing instead to testify publicly about her experience. Her courage in speaking out had inspired dozens of other women to come forward with their own stories of abuse. Morning, Dad. Oakley appeared in the kitchen doorway, hair tousled from sleep, wearing one of my old college sweatshirts that hung loose on her frame. She was still too thin. Stress and trauma had stolen her appetite, but she was eating more each day. "Morning, sweetheart. Coffee? Please." She settled into her usual chair at the kitchen table, the same spot she'd occupied during homework sessions and heart-to-heart talks throughout her childhood. "Any word from the lawyer?" I poured her coffee, adding the exact amount of cream and sugar she preferred, details I'd memorized years ago and never forgotten, even during our estrangement. "The settlement came through yesterday. $6.2 million. Oakley nodded calmly. The money from Graham's family, partly their son's inheritance, partly a desperate attempt to avoid more public scrutiny, meant nothing to her emotionally. She'd already decided exactly how to use it. "That should be enough to get the center started," she said. "I talked to Sarah yesterday about running the day-to-day operations." Sarah Martinez, her old college roommate, had become instrumental in Oakley's healing process. She'd driven cross-country to be here during the trial, and she'd been one of the first to volunteer when Oakley announced her plans to open a residential facility for women escaping abusive relationships. The Oakley Fletcher Center for Women's Independence would provide temporary housing, legal assistance, counseling, and job training for abuse survivors. It was ambitious, expensive, and exactly the kind of project that would have terrified the broken woman Graham had tried to create. But it was perfect for the strong, compassionate person my daughter had always been underneath his manipulation. "Have you decided on a location?" I asked, sitting across from her with my own coffee. "Actually, yes. Do you remember the old Hartwell mansion on Elm Street, the one where Mrs. Hartwell used to host those charity fundraisers when I was little?" I remembered. It was a beautiful Victorian house with multiple bedrooms, sitting on 2 acres of wooded property. Mrs. Hartwell had died the previous year, and her children had been trying to sell it ever since. "It's perfect," Oakley continued, her eyes lighting up with enthusiasm I hadn't seen since before she'd met Graham. 15 bedrooms, space for offices and counseling rooms, and it's in a quiet neighborhood where the women would feel safe. Plus, it has good memories for me. I always felt happy there as a kid. "How much are they asking?" $2 million, which leaves us $4 million for renovations, staffing, and operating expenses for the first few years. I studied my daughter's face, seeing the determination there, the sense of purpose that had been missing for so long. "You're really going to do this?" "I have to, Dad. I keep thinking about all the women who are still trapped like I was, who don't have someone willing to fight for them the way you fought for me. If I can help even one person escape what I went through, then maybe everything I suffered will have meant something." Her words made my chest tight with pride and lingering sadness. She shouldn't have had to endure what Graham put her through, but she was determined to transform her pain into something that could help others. "I want to help," I said. "Not just financially, I want to be involved." Oakley reached across the table and took my hand. Her fingers were warm and steady, no longer trembling the way they had in those first weeks after Graham's arrest. "I was hoping you'd say that. I was thinking you could handle the business side, contracts, insurance, that kind of thing. You're good at protecting people's interests. I'd be honored." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping our coffee and planning a future that neither of us could have imagined 6 months ago. The morning sun had moved higher, filling the kitchen with golden light that reminded me of similar mornings from Oakley's childhood when we'd sit at this same table, discussing her school projects or weekend plans. "Dad?" Oakley's voice was quiet, thoughtful. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Always. During those years when Graham was isolating me from you, when I was being so cold and distant, did you ever think about giving up on me? Did you ever consider just accepting that I was lost?" The question caught me off guard. I set down my coffee cup and really looked at my daughter, not just at the physical scars from her abuse, but at the emotional vulnerability in her eyes, the need to understand how much she'd been loved, even when she couldn't feel it. "Never," I said firmly, "not once. Even when you said you didn't want me at your wedding, even when you wouldn't take my calls, I knew that wasn't really you. A father knows his child, Oakley. I knew something was wrong, even if I couldn't prove it at first." Tears gathered in her eyes. "I said such horrible things to you. I believed such horrible things about you. That wasn't your fault. Graham spent months feeding you lies, isolating you from anyone who might contradict his version of reality. You were a victim, not a villain. But what if you hadn't figured it out in time? What if I'd become like the others? Stop. I reached over and gently touched her cheek, the same way I used to when she was small and afraid of monsters under her bed. That didn't happen. You're here, you're safe, and you're stronger than he ever gave you credit for. The fact that you texted me that night, that some part of you still knew to reach out for help, proves that he never completely broke you. Oakley wiped her eyes and smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached her eyes and reminded me of the little girl who used to greet me at the door every evening when I came home from work. I love you, Dad. I never stopped loving you, even when I couldn't remember how to show it. I love you too, sweetheart, more than you'll ever know. Later that afternoon, we drove out to look at the Hartwell mansion. Oakley walked through the empty rooms with a notebook, sketching floor plans and taking measurements, her mind already transforming the space into something that could shelter and heal. Standing in what would become the main counseling room, watching my daughter plan her future with excitement and determination, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete peace. Graham Whitmore had tried to destroy my family, to steal my daughter, and eventually kill her. Instead, his evil had ultimately brought us closer together than we'd ever been. Oakley and I had both learned what we really meant to each other, and that knowledge had forged a bond that no one could ever break again. 3 months later, the Oakley Fletcher Center for Women's Independence opened its doors. The dedication ceremony was small, just family, close friends, and the first group of women who would call the center home while they rebuilt their lives. As I watched Oakley cut the ribbon, surrounded by people who loved and supported her, I thought about the transfer confirmation that was still sitting in my desk drawer, the $6 million I'd planned to give her as a wedding gift to a man who would have killed her. Instead, that money was now funding a place where women could escape the kind of monster Graham had been, where they could remember who they were before abuse tried to erase them, where they could heal, rebuild, and emerge stronger than ever. It wasn't the wedding gift I'd planned, but it was so much better. My daughter was free, she was safe, and she was using her pain to light the way for others walking through darkness. That was worth more than any amount of money could ever be.